I am now recording. So, those of you who are seeing this recording, you may have missed the introduction, but that's okay. The main thing is coming right now. Dr. Jen Foote.
Thanks, Marsha. It's really good to be here today. Feels interesting to be back on Zoom because I've spent a large portion of the pandemic teaching on Zoom. But then the last half of this last semester, we went back face to face. So I taught half my courses online, and then I met sort of strangers, sort of people I knew from Zoom in the classroom. And so now I'm back on Zoom. And I want to apologize on behalf of my co-author, Ron Thomson. He had planned to be here today, but he had an emergency at the last minute. So I said I could do the whole thing. So if I stumble at any point, just assume that those were the slides that he was supposed to be talking about, and it has nothing to do with me not being prepared. So I'm going this, my goal for this talk was to try, because it's 2 hours, was to try to make it interactive. So we're going to have some discussion and some Zoom polls. So we took a study that we did, and I'm kind of going to let you be mini participants in the study that we did to see what you think. So I'm just going to share my screen here. So as Marsha said, we are talking about ethics, instructors' knowledge base and beliefs underlying second language pronunciation. Um, and so we have an interest in this for a few reasons. One is, of course, ethics are important, and pronunciation is a really interesting area when it comes to ethics. And in fact, there are some things that aren't going to be covered in this talk that are also important that I'm hoping come up in the discussions. And the more I think about it, the more things I think about need to be included. Pronunciation is fairly complex. So, um, oops. So I put, who are we to talk about ethics? I said, it's pretty obvious that the pictures that we used for this talk aren't brand new pictures, which I'm not sure if that's ethical. When I mentioned that to Ron, though, he insisted that his picture is just from a few weeks ago, and he just looks really good in it. Mine is a little bit older. I need to update that. So we're going to present a set of ethical guidelines that we created for second language pronunciation, and also data from a study that we conducted looking at the beliefs and knowledge base of English language teachers, as well as speech language pathologists. I doubt are there any speech language pathologists here? I would be a little bit surprised because they're kind of two separate fields. But the reason we were interested in both is that they're the two main groups that provide pronunciation instruction to learners. Speech language pathologists call it accent modification, but it's often a big part of a lot of SLP's businesses, and a lot of them are offering it. And so we thought it would be good to cover both groups and also compare the groups, because language instructors and speech language pathologists come from very different training backgrounds and often approach pronunciation in a really different way. So today we're going to have an opening discussion. I'm going to put you into breakout rooms in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to talk about how we created the guidelines, then introduce our survey, and then I have a series of quizzes. So I'm going to talk about the data that we came up with, but before I show you what our participants said, I'm going to find out what you said. But this isn't trying to call anyone out on your knowledge base. I set all of the quizzes to be completely anonymous in the responses. So it's really just to get you reflecting, because I think it's more interesting when you think about how you've answered the questions. And then we're going to have a final discussion. Anytime I'm running breakout rooms and polls, it's always hard to know on Zoom for sure what the timing will be like. So how long that final discussion is will depend on how long it goes. And because I am a kind and generous person, there will also be a break partway through so that people can have a stretch, including me. The first thing I wanted to get people thinking about was just your own thoughts about pronunciation. I know pronunciation is an interesting area. I became interested in it because when I was first teaching English, my first teaching job was in Japan, and I knew literally nothing about pronunciation, and yet I was expected to teach it. And so I used some techniques that I now know are pretty dodgy, and I chose some targets that were pretty inappropriate. I was just doing the best I could, which is fine, but I also became really curious about it. So when I went back and I did my master's degree and then my PhD, I focused on pronunciation because I thought it was interesting. And initially, I think based on the textbooks that I had and the knowledge that I had when I was starting out, it was probably the area that I felt the least confident about. And yet my students really wanted it. your discussion questions, and I'm going to put them in the chat before I put you in breakout rooms, so don't worry about trying to memorize these. Your first one is really broad. What are some of the major issues around ethics and pronunciation? And slightly more difficult, if you could make ethical guidelines for teachers of second language pronunciation, what would they be? And create 6 breakout rooms, so that's about 6 participants per room. I'm going to give you 10 minutes. I'll send a little warning out right before I close the rooms. So just do your best with the questions. I'm hoping people can have some interesting discussion, and also not just be staring at me for the whole time. So I'm looking here in my group, we talked about prestige accents. Oh yeah, like received pronunciation, or what they call the standard American. And that we don't really cover that, but it is an area I'm becoming increasingly interested in, is what variety of English are people interested in? And from an intelligibility approach, it's sort of odd that we hold certain varieties of English up higher than others. And we talk about these standards. And I just finished teaching a course in the fall about English as an international language, and how there isn't a correct way to pronounce English or to speak English. There are many, many ways. And that's often not reflected because our materials often come from a couple of standards, right? So, and I actually had a student in a study once who was adamant that he only wanted, and he called it English like from Sherlock on the BBC. And he was studying English in Montreal, and I thought, nobody speaks that way here. I'm not sure why you want that so badly, but he was really adamant that that was what he wanted. There are a lot. Yeah, there are a lot more second language. I'm just looking at the comments here. There are a lot more second language speakers of English than there are first language speakers of English in total, by a huge number, actually. So that's a really good comment as well. Let me just scan the chat and see. Oh, and different goals that students have, right? Some wanting to have their accents reduced as much as possible and asking for that, and others not. And how hard it is to meet the needs and wants of different learners in the same class. And that is a tough one. I'm not talking about it very much in this talk, but I've talked about it in others, how students aren't, when students are sorted based on proficiency, even if it's a speaking class, it's not pronunciation that causes people to be sorted, right? And so you could have students who need help with pronunciation, who have trouble making themselves understood, and others who don't in the same classroom. So then what do you do? So some really good comments. I actually kind of wish we could spend the whole day just talking about this. So a lot of people talking about what is correct pronunciation. And start with correct pronunciation of students' names. Yeah, that's important. There's lots of interesting comments, but I think I'm going to head on just because of time. I loved what people had to say. There are some things that I think a lot of the things are kind of covered in what I'm going to talk about, and maybe there are some things that you hadn't thought of. Someone had said a definition of ethics would have been interesting, and I think that will become clearer as we go through. Oh, we have covered this. Look, we're flying along. So when we were trying to come up with the idea of guidelines for ethical pronunciation instruction, we wanted to see what other relevant work had already been done. And so our original ideas came from previous literature in the area and articles that people had written about this, and our own experience with students, and also with products and services that we had seen advertised. So I put this up. This is one of my favorite examples. It's available on Amazon. Lose your accent in 28 days. And I remember seeing that and thinking, that seems pretty dodgy to me. I don't think that's possible. And so we came up with 8 guidelines, and I'm going to show you the sources that we used. The first one was, and this isn't an exhaustive list, this is just some of the articles that we looked at, looking at things around accent reduction and around issues that people need to pay attention to. Ron and I had also already done some writing on things around like ethics. I did an ethics in the business of pronunciation instruction, because there is a big difference between trying to help learners in your class who need some help with pronunciation when you're a general ESL instructor, and selling specialized services on the internet, often for quite high prices, and making promises about what you can deliver. CATESOL Canada, which is the national association here in my country, has ethical guidelines for language teachers already. And so we looked at those to see what we could draw from those. And we also looked at ethical guidelines coming from the Canadian and American Speech Language Pathology Associations, which have quite extensive codes of ethics. And so between the literature and those codes of ethics, we came up with 8 guidelines. And I'm not going to share them yet because I want to share them as we go through these quiz questions. Now, with the guidelines, we had already conducted a survey where we were interested in the knowledge base of language instructors and speech language pathologists, as I had said. And so we wanted to look at some of the items that had been on that survey, and based on their responses to some of the statements we had and whether they had agreed or not, we wanted to see how well their beliefs were lining up with these 8 guidelines that we had created. So this was our research question: how much do English language teachers and speech language pathologists adhere to ethical standards in second language pronunciation instruction? For this, really, we were having to kind of conjecture based on the beliefs that they had stated. So I'm going to describe how we created this survey, and you're really only going to see a portion of it because it was a big survey. It had a lot of items, and we're just reporting a subset here, mostly because I don't have 8 hours with you, I only have 2. And so respondents had to indicate a level of agreement with belief statements on techniques, things around accent, things around pronunciation, things around how to teach it, things around what you could achieve with it. And all of the statements were taken directly from websites and YouTube videos promoting pronunciation instruction, accent reduction, or accent modification services. So none of them were our own statements. They were well, a few of them were, but most of the things around techniques were things that we had found that were already out there. And we wanted to see initially how well people could evaluate the things that are on the internet. Because if you've ever done research trying to look at how to teach pronunciation, you'll know that there's a huge range of things on the internet, and some of it is good, and some of it actually there's a lot of misinformation out there as well. So this is just an example, and this was sort of a crazy one, which I'm not actually going to ask you, but I will show the responses to it later on. Some ethnic groups have jaw shapes that make learning English pronunciation difficult. I hope everyone realizes that that is certainly not true. And I'll show you how our respondents did with it. But it was something that we found out there on a pronunciation website, which is kind of shocking in and of itself. And I think highlights the need to talk about things around ethics and pronunciation. We distributed the survey through LinkedIn relative interest groups that language instructors or speech language pathologists might join. And we forwarded the survey to different institutions and asked people to forward it on. So we just sent it out on the internet however we could to try to get as many people as possible. We ended up with 60 English language teachers and 71 speech language pathologists. We had more response from Canada, but we did have people from the United States as well with different first languages, though the majorities were first language English speakers. And in terms of training, you can see for the English language teachers, 62% had master's degrees, 30% had bachelor's degrees in TESOL or linguistics, and 8% had bachelor's degrees in an unrelated field. The vast majority of speech language pathologists had a master's degree because that is a profession you need to have that's legally regulated, and a master's degree is what you need to get that certification. Now, in terms of pronunciation or specific things, for the English language teachers, 60 had taken a related linguistics course, and like most of them had some kind of related linguistics course. An entire course related to pronunciation instruction, 19 of the English language instructors had that. 3 of the speech language pathologists did. And for the English language teachers, you can see quite a few had taken sporadic workshops at conferences like this one, and fewer of the speech language pathologists had. And we weren't that surprised that not a huge number had taken a whole course in pronunciation, because a lot of teacher training programs don't offer a whole course in pronunciation. Some have a speaking course where it might be covered. I did have it in my master's, but that was partly luck because a big pronunciation researcher happened to be housed at my university in my master's program. And a survey I did quite a while ago of Canadian programs found that not very many programs available in Canada actually have standalone pronunciation courses. So now, like I said, I've created 4 quizzes. And each quiz relates to some of the guidelines we created, but I'm going to make you answer the questions before I show you the guidelines. So you can take the quiz and see how you compared to our respondents. Here's the first round. There's just 5 questions. And like I said, I have set it up so that the answers are anonymous, because this is really just to get you thinking. I'm not secretly conducting research here, and I'm not looking to call anyone out. Let me put up the first one. I just have 3 categories there: agree, disagree, and unsure. Can everyone see the questions? Here are the questions for the if you can't access the poll for whatever reason, so that you can see them. Fun fact, we have a Canadian on Jeopardy right now who's on a 14-day win streak. It's very exciting for us. Okay, I'm going to close the poll down, and let's see how everyone did. Can people see the results now? Yep, great. Okay, so for completely comfortable teaching segmentals, we have a division. Some people are and some people aren't. And super segmentals, about the same. People, yeah, interesting. Okay. Pronunciation should only be offered by instructors who have taken specific courses. So some people agree and some disagree. And that's actually a tricky question, and I'll talk to everyone about it in a minute. Because like I said, there is also a big difference between doing it as part of your job. Like when I was first teaching and didn't know about it, I still needed to do my best, and that's okay. Versus charging a lot of money and having a lot of, and being a specialist in it. And then, so most of you think that you're qualified, which is great. Some people aren't sure, if you disagree. And it looks like a large percentage wish they had more training. And I found in different studies I've done and talking to teachers, that's a pretty consistent result, is that a lot of people wish that they had more training in pronunciation. Okay, so now I am going to stop sharing because I want to show you how the people in our survey did and what the ethical guidelines were. So the first 2 ethical guidelines, and these aren't actually in the order we wrote them. They were in the order that I was trying to combine questions to try to make this into a neat 2-hour talk. So we said that individuals offering pronunciation instruction should have specialized training. A degree in TESOL or speech language pathology may not be sufficient to qualify someone as an expert of pronunciation. And we know for speech language pathologists, often because their primary business is speech disorders, that often they don't have very much training or knowledge of how second languages are learned, which is something that ESL instructors have, though they do often have a lot of training in things like phonetics. And also that people should continue to seek professional development and be aware of new research or developments, which anyone who's here, you're definitely doing that. I had already showed this, but I just think it's interesting, an interesting starter to just remember the background that people said that they had. So with this, we found that even though a lot of people hadn't actually had a lot of training in pronunciation, they were a lot more confident than the people in this seminar that they thought that they could teach pronunciation. And so there seemed to be a little bit of a disconnect between the training that people had and the confidence that they had. And of course, it's possible too. I know some instructors who didn't get as much pronunciation training during their teacher training as they wanted and took it upon themselves to learn a lot about pronunciation. And there's some great resources out there. But we thought it was interesting that it seemed like people were confident above which they had been trained. Now, interestingly, though, there were a fair number that also agreed that pronunciation instruction should only be offered by people who have taken some kind of course on pronunciation. And so again, there's a bit of a disconnect because a lot of people thought that the training should exist, but didn't actually have the training themselves. And part of that, I think, is that sometimes people take it upon themselves to learn a lot on their own. Also, a lot of these items were kept far apart so that people wouldn't automatically answer based on their previous answer. So if we look that most of them hadn't had a course in teaching pronunciation, thought they were qualified, but also had said that they should have had a course in pronunciation. So we just thought it was kind of interesting that people's confidence and their training levels, there was a bit of disconnect there between what. And here, okay, and someone put, it's important to define how we define pronunciation training. Yeah, and so some people, there are different ways that you can get training in pronunciation. So for that, and the classic case of, yeah, you don't know what you don't know. And I think that can happen a lot. I've worked a lot with people doing professional development in terms of giving the basics of pronunciation instruction. And I give a lot of seminars to people in my area, especially in Alberta, but other places as well, going over the basics. And it can be interesting often how people who have had training in language instruction really have a lot of misconceptions around pronunciation, and sometimes haven't learned about, you know, the difference between accentedness and intelligibility, for example, which I'm going to be talking about in a minute. So I am going to launch into the next poll here. And I will try to remember to share it at the end this time. If you can't access the poll for whatever reason, you can just look at the questions on the screen. And now you should be able to see the results. Can everyone see them? Okay, so we had 81% disagreeing that a foreign accent is not like other communication disorders. I will get to that one in a minute. There was a bit of a trick in that question, it is true. Increase your range of motion by moving your chin from side to side and up and down. Okay, so that was kind of a mixed one. Most people aren't sure or disagree about placing instruments in your mouth. And you'll see right away why we chose that one. I think people's instincts are good on that. This one is a bit of a strange one. And I think, yeah, quite a few of you were unsure. Lots of you disagreed. Good. And ongoing treatment is necessary. So that's an interesting one as well. So I'm going to stop sharing and you can just think about the answers that you gave. And I'm going to show you the ethical guidelines that these ones kind of get at too. And yeah, someone said, I find it squicky to group foreign accents with disorders of any kind. Treatment makes me think of snake oil salesman. Yeah, and so some of those questions were targeted somewhat to speech language pathologists, because a concern that we have based on the training that speech language pathologists get is that they primarily work with speech disorders, but second language accents are not speech disorders. Having a detectable second language accent is just a natural part of learning a second language. Any of us, if we learn a language as an adult, are going to sound noticeably accented in that language. There are a few exceptions. There are exceptional learners, but there aren't exceptional treatments. So this is one of our guidelines, is that a second language accent should be viewed as a natural part of speech development. A second language accent is not a speech disorder. And again, that one was somewhat targeting speech language pathologists, because even though often they are taught that in their programs, it's sort of one of those things when what you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And so when everything you do is related to speech disorders, often then it's easy to start looking at accent as a speech disorder as well. And some of the techniques that I showed there are also techniques that come out of speech language pathology and have been sort of transferred to second language pronunciation. And pronunciation instruction should not be continued if such instruction is ineffective or unnecessary. So looking at these items individually, I think we've kind of covered this one. Now, most people disagreed with this, but some did. And we can see that speech language pathologists agreed with it more, which kind of goes with our idea that it's easy to view accent as a pathology when that's primarily what you're trained in. Now, these techniques are interesting because unsure is probably a good response here, because these aren't techniques that have really been tested in terms of second language pronunciation. These are techniques that are much more common in speech language pathology, especially the instruments placed in your mouth. And, you know, there are things I've seen advertised called speech buddies, for example, which are these tools that show where your tongue should go. And they were really developed for children with speech disorders to try to help them. But they have been they're quite expensive, and they've been marketed to people for second language pronunciation, often at a fairly high cost. And so some of these techniques started in speech language pathology, but kind of trickled over. And we don't actually have evidence that these things are helpful for second language pronunciation. This one, final consonants are very, very aggressive in America. The final consonants need to be deleted to not sound angry. And this is goes with the ineffective treatment, because I'm thinking maybe what this person was getting at was linking and thinking about linking words or connected speech. But actually, final consonants in English can be quite important for intelligibility. And I've worked with learners from certain language backgrounds where final consonants and consonant clusters are a big challenge. And we actually were able to measure how intelligible their speech was and comprehensible with listeners afterwards. And working on improving actually saying those final consonants helped them be a lot easier to understand. And certainly by saying them, they didn't sound aggressive. Seeing a lot of districts view English language accents as a speech pathology problem. Yeah, and that's pretty common. With this, one of the things I know as a language teacher, because I taught English for years in Canada and abroad, and I still to this day, sometimes if you don't know something, you Google it, right? And so you want to see a lot of teachers don't have a lot of training. And so if we Google how well can people analyze what's really good advice and what's not such good advice. And so this would be something that I think isn't very good advice. And we were curious to see if people were able to recognize that. Teaching pronunciation does not usually result in permanent changes. Ongoing treatment is necessary. Now, for this, teaching pronunciation, of course, we have all had the thing where we teach students something in class, and this is true not just of pronunciation, but anything with language, and then it seems like the next week they're not getting it as well as when you first taught it. But if ongoing treatment is necessary, if you're treating it like it's something like, well, you have an accent like you have type 2 diabetes or something, and you're going to need treatment for the rest of your life, that's not really true, right? And so pronunciation instruction can result in long-term changes, and we've seen that with delayed post-tests. And ongoing treatment is necessary up until a learner doesn't need it anymore. And so we were concerned about this idea that someone thinks they kind of need to be seeing an accent specialist for the rest of their lives if they want to be working. And that's just not true. So I'm going to run quiz number 3. And I think some of these we've already touched on. So you might have some clues to the answers already. Here we go. All right, let's see how people answered. Okay, people, number one makes me really happy. We nailed it. Yeah, the goal of pronunciation should be to eliminate as much as possible foreign accents. And so most people disagreed with that, and which I would agree with as well. Instructors are able to eliminate or nearly eliminate an accent. Most people disagreed with that as well. The goal of pronunciation teaching should be to help make students comfortably intelligible, even if they still have a strong accent. Most people agreed with that. Someone can have a very strong accent and still be highly intelligible and comprehensible. Most of you agreed with that. Only native speakers should teach pronunciation. Most of you disagreed with that. So I would say, generally speaking, everyone's views here are very much in line with our own. And so here are the guidelines that we came up with that related to these questions. Pronunciation should focus primarily on intelligibility rather than reduction of accent. There are a couple of main reasons for that. And so, because one question I often get is, well, students want to reduce their accents. If that's their goal, shouldn't we help them? And to some degree, I think whatever a learner's goal is, we should respect. But a big thing is it's usually not possible, right? It's especially if you're just teaching a regular class, it's possible to make learners' pronunciation more intelligible. We have a wealth of research now that shows that. There was a statistical meta-analysis done of instructed pronunciation a few years ago, which showed that pronunciation instruction works. But there isn't evidence that there's any technique that is going to have someone sound just like a first language speaker for adults. Now, maybe spy training, I mentioned that in another group, and there have been jokes about that. John Levis, a big researcher in the area, said that really accent elimination is really just the purview of spies, but for most students, it's not a realistic goal. And it's also unnecessary. There is a huge amount of research showing that having that accentedness and intelligibility are not the same thing, and that you can have a really noticeable accent and still be very, very easy to understand. Now, this last one is, I think, pretty clear, and I don't know that it needs a lot of comment, that pronunciation instructions should respect the dignity and rights of people without prejudices to race, religious beliefs, sex, gender identity or expression, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, physical characteristics. And this gets at the idea of native speakers should be the only ones teaching pronunciation. There was more agreement in the survey than there was in this room. Most people in the survey also disagreed, but there were a number who were unsure and some who agreed. And some also who thought that teachers are able to eliminate or nearly eliminate a learner's accent. And really, I haven't seen evidence of that. And I know I have done a lot of research on pronunciation techniques and teaching pronunciation, and I certainly have not been able to do that. There are disagreements as to exactly why, looking at research around the critical period for language development and what happens when we move into adulthood in our brains. But whatever the mechanism is or the exact reason for it, we know that it is the case that the vast majority of adult learners of a second language will have a noticeable accent in that language. I think what's interesting is that some people actually disagreed that the goal should be to help make students intelligible even if they have a strong accent. And I think that probably comes from people thinking that their job is to try to get rid of accent as much as they can. Most, but not everyone, agreed that a person can have a very strong accent and still be highly intelligible or comprehensible. So we can see, like, some people agreed or were disagreed or were unsure. And I think the reason for that is that even though there has been about 30 years of research looking at the relationship between having an accent and how easy or difficult someone is to understand, and yet it's still a very commonly held belief that a heavy accent means you're difficult to understand. And I don't hear that a lot from people I know who work in pronunciation anymore, but I still hear it from people in general. And the number of times I've heard that person has a strong accent, so I can't understand them, the two tend to be equated, and that being easier to understand means having less of an accent. Where even though there are lots of examples that you can probably think of in your own life and people you know of people who have very noticeable accents, but are also extremely easy to understand. And so a lot of research in pronunciation now is looking at, well, what aspects of speech matter the most for helping someone to be easier to understand. And that's really what we should be focusing on. Respecting the rights and dignity. And this is the idea that only native speakers should teach pronunciation. Oh, this is a great comment. I want to address it actually, that often the problem is people not being able to understand a variety of accents. Listeners should train themselves more. I strongly agree with that. And actually, I'm giving a talk to some local teachers next week about that. That the role of the listener in pronunciation is really important. And we know that familiarity and open-mindedness, there are a lot of reasons a message might not get through, but that intelligibility is a two-way street. And that the people receiving the message are also responsible for helping to create understanding. And so it's not all on the speaker. And I like to tell my students about that as well, because sometimes students can feel badly if they're having trouble being understood. And I think sometimes it's not really the student, it's so much as if you have someone who has very little experience with accents, or someone who believes that they will have trouble understanding someone, communication might not come through. Yeah, some companies are doing accent recognition courses. And I know for sure this idea that it's completely up to the language learner to make themselves understood, it's not really fair. And it will never be successful if you have people who are sort of, their ears are somewhat closed to accented speech. This one here, only native speakers should teach pronunciation. This one actually in the survey, I found it a little pretty shocking actually, that such a high percentage of people thought that that was true. A lot more speech language pathologists agreed with it. And speech language pathology, I noticed with respondents in general and in classes I visited, it seems like there are, I know a lot of people who are second language speakers who teach English. And I think it's more common than in speech language pathology. But if you teach English pronunciation, you need to have a certain level, you need, it's good if you're comfortably intelligible yourself. There's no reason why a person with a second language accent can't teach pronunciation effectively. And there's a lot of discussion even that with what we were talking about earlier with varieties of English, that having a highly intelligible second language speaker is often a better model because that's an attainable model for learners. Saying you need to sound exactly like a native speaker, they're not going to be successful, but saying if you can get your pronunciation closer to this highly intelligible second language speaker, that's actually a more reasonable goal. And also people who learned English as a second language and have intelligible pronunciation have personal experience with how they did that and what their techniques were. So the idea that if you haven't grown up speaking English as a first language that you can't teach pronunciation is just untrue. And I put this one on even though it wasn't in the quiz. What's shocking here is that some people agreed with it. Some ethnic groups have jaw shapes that make learning English pronunciation difficult, and quite a few people were unsure. And we found that really shocking as well, especially because even if you have studied nothing to do with languages or speech language pathology or anything, you just need to think about the people you know. If you grow up hearing a language, you will have the accent of that language. It doesn't matter what your ethnicity is or the shape of your jaw is. So that one we found pretty frightening and disheartening actually. All right, one more quiz. This is the last one, I promise. All right, I'm going to end this now. And we can share the results. Number one is a bit of a tricky one. Help clients turn on or off their accented sounds whenever the need arises. Yeah, number one reminds me of code switching. And that's where number one is a bit tricky because people do code switch and accent switch. I've known people or I've heard people who speak English differently depending on who they're speaking to. Even with first language accents, a friend of mine is from Newfoundland, and you can barely tell she's from Newfoundland when she's talking to her Alberta friends. And people from Newfoundland have, if I guess this is an American audience, have very distinct sort of, you might say, Irish sounding accent. A lot of people from Newfoundland originally come from Ireland. When she's talking, if she gets a phone call and it's someone from back home, her accent immediately becomes much, much stronger and more like when she first arrived. So people are able to code switch. But the idea that students can just sort of have this first language perfect native speaker accent and switch it on and off, again, that's probably a bit unrealistic. In private classes, students can experience major success in as little as 2 hours. We have some disagreement there, and I'll talk about that more in a minute, actually, when we look at the results. It partially depends on what you define as major success. Students need only practice for 5 minutes every day to experience good results in a month. And that's a tricky one too, because it gets a little bit at, well, what's good results. I've often advocated for 5 minutes a day as well, but I've never seen someone practice for 5 minutes a day for a month where I come back and I'm like, wow, you're like, I can't even believe it's the same voice. And then we have, an accent does not mean you don't know how to speak a language, but it may limit you at work and home. And this last one, which ended up being a bit of a wash, accent modification training can provide you with a distinct competitive advantage. So I'm going to stop sharing there and look at the guidelines we created. And some of these, the way they're worded, it's a little bit dodgy, but I'll kind of tell you what we were thinking about in terms of these. So one is that individuals shouldn't make exaggerated claims about the efficacy of the instruction that they offer or the results of services and products offered. And this is where we have often noticed in advertising that there can be some pretty bold claims about what specialists, either through specialist training or packages, or you saw that book, like Lose Your Accent in 28 Days, which we know that's just not possible. It's certainly not possible with a book and a CD. Also, that individuals or organizations shouldn't use fear-based advertising that demonizes a second language accent. Advertisement should be honest and appropriate. Yeah, and Elizabeth, you're right. Questions 4 and 5 are kind of getting at prejudice perceptions. Now, the problem is, of course, there are prejudice perceptions. And I wrote a book chapter recently on accent discrimination in the workplace. And that's a very real thing. But often what advertising does is it makes the learners think you need to get rid of your accent because you won't advance at work, people won't be your friends, as opposed to attacking the discrimination. It's sort of putting the onus on the learners. And there are a lot of products out there that kind of use fear-based advertising, like you better get rid of your accent or else. And I think that that's not helpful. So with this one, again, a lot of people agreed that instructors can help clients turn on or off many of their accented sounds. To some degree, that's true, but also it does make it sound a lot simpler than it is. And the degree to which sort of like you can just quickly get this first language sounding accent and use it whenever you like. Now, in terms of major success in as little as 2 hours, a lot of people agreed with that, and more speech language pathologists. And I have seen some speech language pathology institutes offer 2-hour sessions at quite high prices. And my understanding is what you mostly get in those 2-hour sessions are a rundown of basically the phonetics of English and the sounds and where their spot places of articulation. Now, I have had students where I only get 2 hours with them, and I'll do the best I can. Say, here are some good ways to practice pronunciation. Here are some basics about the sound systems of English and how it works. And so in 2 hours, you can get some useful techniques and you can get some basic information. If you think you're going to pay a few $100s and get a magical 2-hour session that's going to have a huge impact, I would question that is the case. You can get some helpful information in that amount of time, but it's going to take a lot more than that to have a noticeable impact on how you speak. The 5 minutes every day to have good results in a month, again, I've advocated for a short amount of time each day too. I think it's better for learners to practice a little bit each day than a whole bunch once in a while, which is my tendency because I tend to procrastinate and then try to make up for it with big binge sessions when I'm learning anything. But really, that is a good starting point, but it's likely not enough to get huge results in a month, though it may be enough to get you some good results on a certain feature or aspect that you're working on. And I have had in 8 weeks, I've had learners practice a technique called shadowing for 10 minutes a day, 4 times a week for 8 weeks and shown improvement. There's a pronunciation website that my colleague Ron uses where in a short period of time people can show improvement. And so you can get results in a month. It's unlikely that you're going to have magical results in a month, but if you're working on a specific feature, it's possible. These two, again, it's tricky because I think there can be some truth in that people are discriminated against based on their accents. But I think there's an ethical issue with using fear-based advertising to get second language learners to buy your product. And there's an alarming amount of that out there. It seems like it's maybe getting a little bit better, but it doesn't help the situation to try to make learners scared that their pronunciation is a big issue, especially because often if you have highly intelligible speech already, then spending a lot of money on accent reduction is probably not actually going to help you all that much. And again, this gets at a very accent reduction based position as opposed to looking at intelligibility and with pronunciation instruction. So we would like it if advertising cleaned itself up a little bit and tried to be a little bit less demonizing of the idea of a second language accent, especially because if you're learning a second language as an adult, you're going to have one.